Hello Idle Hero fans, thank you for joining me today as I'm going to be doing a video to continue a series that I started quite a long time ago. I think it might have been like 2 or 3 months honestly, where I kind of look at the progression of a hero through the history of Idle Heroes. And the last one I did was Mickey, and I thought it was pretty good. I actually thought it was one of my better videos. A little bit more explanation over time and a little bit more history, which is something that's a little hard to find on this game because there wasn't really a lot of players playing back then. It was probably only about 50,000 people, maybe 100,000. And while that obviously sounds like a lot, most of those people probably don't play the game too seriously, so it was hard to gain information back then. And anyway, as you could probably tell by the cover art for this, or the thumbnail for this video, we're going to be looking at Sleepless, who looks crazy as fuck in his new 10-star iteration, which is awesome. But as with the Mickey video, I'm going to have to go back to the start when Sleepless came out. And honestly, Sleepless came out a long time ago. He was released with the As Model patch, and those two were introduced as the first new Light and Dark heroes. At that time, we actually only had Gurk and Arthendal were like the only real options at that point if you wanted a Light and Dark hero. So if you're trying to run the Light and Dark or the Rainbow Aura, you needed to have both of those on your team. Something else to consider is that a lot of the new bonuses didn't exist, the new auras. So for example, you couldn't have the aura that existed on 2 blue, 2 green, and 2 light. You couldn't make that faction. That just didn't exist. That only came out semi-recently. So basically, the only use for Light and Dark heroes at that point were to make a Rainbow Aura. Because technically you could make an entirely dark or an entirely light team, but the resources to do that would have been astronomical. Even back then when there was only like 5 and 6 stars that were relevant. Like, of course, you could always level up to 9. As soon as 6 stars came out, you could level up to 9 stars, but not many people had even eclipsed like the 7-star ratio when they first came out. So, but even looking at that, it would have been damn near impossible because of the amount of dark and light heroes it takes and how rare they are. So anyway, to kind of compare Sleepless to the meta at the time, a lot of people were still using things like Dominator, which is here. Yeah, Dominator was still a really strong tank back then. More about his 5-star iteration though. Where are you? There you are. Which, looking back on it now, is kind of comical, but Dominator was considered a good tank back then. And when he first got nerfed, people started to switch over to things like Dragon Slayer, which is even more comical because they're pretty much just the same hero, just giant HP walls. So when Sleepless came out, it was kind of a surprise, if you knowing what we know now, that Sleepless didn't instantly kind of go through the roof. Because Sleepless is insanely powerful compared to these heroes. His damage and tankiness have been like overwhelming for a while, but as the title suggests, people never really bought into it, and that's myself included. I had always kind of steered away from Sleepless, and I had always recommended Dark Arthendal to anyone who was looking to make a Rainbow or a faction bonus because I couldn't really see the value in him. To me, he kind of represented all the lessons we learned when it came to moving away from heroes like Dominator and heroes like Dragon Slayer, because they were just giant HP walls, and so was Sleepless at the time, or at least that's how he was perceived to be. But as time went on, we started to notice that his abilities add up pretty quick. Of course, we probably shouldn't look at the 10-star actually, because it's going to give a false representation. If we look at the 5-star even though, his attack does 80% damage to backline units, which at the time was a big deal because not everyone had adapted the second slot being the safe spot yet. So hitting all backline units and then having a 100% chance to tag them again for 160% attack was actually ridiculous. Now, I'm pretty sure he's gotten buffs, so it probably wasn't 160% when he first came out, but even if it was 100%, this essentially guaranteed double damage for his ability, whereas tanks weren't doing anything like that before. Again, let's just for a quick moment jump over to Dominator, and look, he just does 80% flat. That's it. And he's gotten buffed recently too, so his attack probably did less before that. So we're looking at Dominator probably doing like 70% of his attack, whereas... Ah, shit, I went to the 10-star one again. Whereas Sleepless would have been doing 80, which would have been matching what Dominator was doing, but then an additional 100% chance to do basically double that damage. That was unprecedented, honestly, for just flat-out damage. But not only that, Sleepless also offers a kind of a shitty percent, but it is there, chance to petrify, which is just bonus crowd control to your team. Now, 20% honestly is not that great, but when it actually procs, it's very beneficial, especially if they have another strong tank, like if they had Sleepless, or Brea, or Sigmund, or something like that. Obviously, Brea and Sigmund wouldn't have been as relevant before, but something like an Ice Blink would have been more realistic to stop back then. But still, if you could paralyze one of those units, or petrify one of those units, that would have been amazing. Plus, his attack also procs these round marks, which does even more damage. So it basically makes his basic attacks do 165% damage instead of just 100%, which I think that's one of the big problems with Sleepless that people just didn't realize, is that there's kind of a lot of math at work here. When you look at it at a glance, it's hard to tell how much damage is actually done because it's hidden behind so many different numbers. It's hidden behind the fact that his ability does flat damage, but then also does the percent damage additionally after 2 rounds. His auto attacks, or his basic attacks, do a flat damage, then additional damage on top of that after a few rounds. And then the most underrated ability that anyone has really ever seen in the course of this game, and that is counterattacks. And it's kind of funny because counterattacks were never considered good for a very, very long time. Pretty much, I'd say 75 to 80% of this game, counterattacks were just considered trash. They were irrelevant. But as of the past like 2 months, people have started to realize that having someone with a counterattack in the first slot is actually insanely good for damage. So not only do you have Sleepless doubling the average tank's damage with his abilities, and then giving him 150+% extra damage on his second ability with his basic attacks, this counterattack nonsense just starts to go crazy. Now, I'll be the first to admit, and this is actually where I started to shy away from Sleepless when I first heard that he might be strong, was that a 55% chance to counterattack is kind of bad. I don't like how low that is, because you could easily go with like 4 or 5 attacks and just not counterattack any of them. Now, I know that's not probability, but there are going to be fights where that happens, and that means that Sleepless's value starts to drop off a little bit. But the one thing you do have to factor in when concluding this, or when trying to calculate that, is the fact that he does have this rebirth in Dark, which means that he does revive. And that means he's basically going to get more chances as well to counterattack. So he's having, was it 30,000 HP, which compares to Dominator's 36,000. So he's actually like what, like just over 10% less HP. So he's probably at around like 15% less HP than Dominator, but his ability to rebirth gives him 60% extra flat HP. So he's going to end up with more total HP, which equals more time to actually counterattack. And that kind of balances out the 55% ratio. And that becomes even more so when you look at his level 6 star, because it goes up to 70%. And as you can tell by looking at his 10 star, once he gets to 9 stars and then of course 10 stars, that actually goes up to 85%, and his revival becomes 100% HP. So this guy is kind of like exponential growth in terms of a hero. He starts off very similar to Asmodel, actually, with a pretty good 5 star. Not amazing, but pretty good. Where his stats kind of eclipse the average hero a little bit. But as he starts to level up into his 6, 7, 8, 9, and then eventually, of course, 10 star, he becomes absolutely ridiculous. And when you look at this guy's HP, he has around 900,000 HP altogether when you calculate the rebirth. And that's without gear. Obviously there's no gear, there's no guild faction bonuses on this. So this is just flat stats. If you add percentages onto this as well from gear, and from the guild tree, for example, or any gems or artifacts that you're gonna have, and then auras as well, he starts to become insanely tanky and just keeps dealing damage over time. It adds up, and it's unavoidable how much damage this guy will do. And eventually the petrify that he does with his basic attack ends up hitting around 35%, which is still not great, but because he lasts so long, chances are you'll probably get at least one of those petrifies every turn, or every fight, I should say. Of course, probability will dictate some fights you won't, but most of them you probably will, because he's probably going to last more than 3 turns. He's probably going to last more than 4 or 5 turns, honestly, with how survivable he is, even in the first slot. And that starts to get even more ridiculous when you combine him with, like, the new Ormus. Ormus right now is in such a mess because of how strong his heals are. And when you pair someone who has heals like that with someone who has tank stats like this, as well as damage over time like this, you start to get a mess of attacks and mess of stats. This guy just cannot be killed. It's absolutely madness. And his damage, like I said, where it's damage over time, it's not like instantly. You're not going to burst people down with Sleepless, but if you do end up lasting like 6, and God forbid you last 9 rounds against a Sleepless, and holy shit, you are going to see the damage that this guy puts out from the first spot. Now, I'll admit it's a little unrealistic for him to survive till 9 turns, even with his tanky stats and maybe even with an Ormus, because chances are you've either lost or won by that point. 9 rounds is a pretty long fight, but getting to 6 and 7 rounds is very feasible, and even by then you'll start seeing some crazy damage from this guy. And that's not to mention, he actually has a perk that goes unnoticed to most people. It might not be unnoticed now, but it definitely was for a long time, and that is if you pair him with Aiden or with Flame Strike, when he dies the first time for the Rebirth in Dark and then comes back, that actually counts as a death for them to boost them up. So if you have a team with Flame Strike or Aiden as well as Sleepless, that is a very good way to boost them up. Now, of course, on the flip side, anyone who else is observant will notice that that works for the enemy's Flame Strike as well. It also works for enemies, Demon Hunters and Kareems, if they so happen to have them. Demon Hunter probably being the more relevant one there, because those guys also get bonuses when your enemies die. So it's hard to say whether or not that's truly a benefactor, but if you're going to go with a team that kind of relies on Flame Strike's ability to just one-shot your opponent, heroes like Sleepless and Michelle are very, very helpful for that meta. And they just benefit that kind of style. Especially since not only are they going to give her a bonus, but they're also going to stay alive long enough that they can kind of protect her while she tries to go off. Because if you end up with just the Flame Strike, if all your allies die and you just have Flame Strike sitting there, chances are she's probably going to get crowd controlled before she even gets to one-shot the enemy team, and then she's just going to get chained into death, because she does have a lot of HP, but not enough to stay alive. Not enough like Sleepless has. Sleepless has like 900,000, whereas Sleepless has 900,000 effective HP, whereas Flame Strike has like 55 or 550,000. So obviously she has a lot of HP, but not quite compared to top tier tanks, and that's where Sleepless really helps her. And basically any hero that's basically looking to benefit off of a tank that just keeps them alive so they can do damage over time. So things like Margaret, for example, or even Brea. Pairing another warrior with Sleepless is kind of silly, it might sound like, but this is the hero or the warrior meta that I was starting to talk about, where if you put those 2 guys on the same team and have an Ormus to help keep them alive, and you have the little Bambi pet, for lack of a better word, the little deer that heals them as well as gives them extra dodge, plus they have dodge in their guild tech tree, it starts to get real messy really fast. Their stats start to get out of control, and it doesn't seem like the power is coming from any one specific spot, because it's kind of coming from everywhere. They have too much HP, they do too much damage, and they have way too much survivability when paired with healers, especially Ormus, now that Ormus's heal is just stupid at 10 stars. Anyone who's fought an Ormus at 10 star or has an Ormus at 10 star knows exactly what I'm talking about. He definitely needs to be nerfed, not buffed like they just recently did. I actually don't understand why they did that, but that's a topic for another video. But yeah, guys, tell me what you guys think about Sleepless. Do you guys agree that he was kind of very underrated when he first came out, because he was overshadowed by Asmodel? When Asmodel first came out, most people recognize that he was super strong and tried to work towards him instead of Gurk, whereas Arthendal still kind of remained the dark hero over Sleepless. But then eventually now, as time is going on, people are starting to realize how powerful Sleepless really is. Or do you disagree and just think that I'm blowing this out of proportion? Do you think that there's not enough data to support it? Because ultimately it is true. It's very hard to find data on 10-star heroes. But with the track record of the 9-star, 8 and 9-star Sleeplesses that we've seen, I think it's a pretty fair conclusion to say that he's just going to be an absolute monster at 10-star, given that his stats what he does didn't really change. Of course, if you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. But let me know what you guys think ultimately, no matter what it is, negative or bad, or if you disagree, just let me know. But as always, thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day.